Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I want to first thank the and the task force for inviting me to speak. I had a presentation. I think I'm waiting for the PowerPoint slide to load, but I will not be able to go by the PowerPoint slide in the interest of time, so I'll try to make this as brief as possible. But the nature of my talk, if we can go back to the first slide, the goal of my discussion or my talk was going to be to provide a model that would solidify the argument for reparations. Can you go to the first slide, please? The cover slide.
I'm sorry, this is the first slide.
Okay. Anyway, so the title of my presentation was Historical Trauma and its Intergenerational Transmission, the Tulsa Race War of 1921 as a case study. And what I was trying to do in this discussion was to make the point, the counterpoint, that it's not really that much of a stretch to make the argument that enslavement has had a psychological impact on contemporary African Americans, and there is empirical research that proves that. And so I was trying to provide a model to do that. So I'm using the Tulsa Race War as that model. So we know that that historical trauma is real, that there are several important events in the history of this country that solidify that argument. We know there have been over 5,000 African Americans lynched between 1985. We know there were over 30 major acts of ethno violence, including Tulsa, Rosewood, and other communities that were burned to the ground. African folks were tortured and murdered. Next slide. And so it's also important to know that this is not really a thing of the past. And you don't have to watch TV or Facebook or YouTube to understand that African Americans are still the primary targets of racial violence and ethno violence. And there is a scarcity of research that examines psychological trauma in relation to racial trauma or racial violence. Next slide. The legacy of slavery, as was already mentioned in my predecessor's discussion of cultural trauma, but the legacy of slavery provides a collective lens through which African Americans see the world. And it's through this lens that we can understand the psychological harm that's been done. Next slide. Again, trauma is as that which occurs to an entire culture during the same period in a common geographical area caused by the same agency, whether it be human or natural. And so this concept of cultural trauma is really the instrument which we understand how it's transmitted across generations. Next slide. And again, I apologize for going fast, but I know we're out of time. Next slide. Here is a graph that kind of delineates how the dominant group imposes their will on the subordinate group, and the trauma that results is passed across generations through various means, as was said earlier, not just through expression, but through silence. Next slide. And so essentially, I'll just jump into to the crux of my argument or discussion. Essentially, I had the opportunity to visit Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood section, about 20 years ago. About 20 years ago, the survivors of Black Wall Street were numerous. Now I think there's one survivor left. When I went, I had the opportunity to talk to 12 survivors and about 20 odd of their descendants. And so I conducted a focus group, transcribed the focus group, and began to look for themes in what they had to share about their experience. And my purpose was trying to find this common thread of trauma and resilience. Next slide. And so what I discovered in talking to the survivors of the race war is that the transmission of that trauma was primarily the function of silence, that the entire community was not only silenced, but they participated in that silencing process. And when I asked people, why didn't you tell your children about what happened? They said they wanted to protect them. And so I understand, again, when we're having these so-called talks with our children, right, we are transmitting that trauma. Now, these talks are necessary because we want to keep them safe. But again, we have to understand the unique ways in which this trauma is transmitted across generations, so we can begin to cease or kind of reframe how that happens. Next slide. And so again, we see that this mass racial violence, not just racial violence, but mass racial violence. I mean, from Wilmington, North Carolina, to Chicago, to Detroit, to Tulsa, to Rosewood, Florida, to St. Louis during the Red Hot Summer, was something that happened in three waves. It wasn't just the Red Hot Summer. It was post-Reconstruction, it was the Jim Crow era, and then the Red Hot Summer. So there had been waves earlier, prior to the Red Hot Summer, that happened that also resulted in mass racial violence. Next slide. Again, I can't go into all this, but it really is important. Next slide. We tend, I wanted to talk about the Trail of Tears, how black folks got to Oklahoma. We tend to romanticize many experiences resulting from enslavement. And I know I grew up with the same narrative about being half Cherokee that many black folks did. When I discovered that Cherokee actually owned black people, it kind of began to reshape my vision of my identity. I'm pretty sure that my mother and father and their mother and father were trying of having to explain that your light skin is a function of rape, right? And that is a consequence, as you look in the mirror every day, of the experience of African people. And so we try to dress it up, romanticize it, and make it as though there are other explanations when the evidence is in our face. Next slide. Again, next slide. So the exact events that resulted in the Tulsa Race War are perhaps important as well, but we can't cover them now. But the point is that there's a legacy, right? That if you go to Tulsa today, you can still witness the legacy of the race riot contemporarily, although the exact events are still not known by many Tulsans or people in the Greenwood section, because the silence continues. Next slide. And even the people who were at the center of the race riot somehow disappeared and were lost from history. Dick Rowland, again, was the man they were going to lynch. And again, the important message I want to end with, although I'm having reviewed everything, but I have to end in the instance of time. The people from Tulsa, and please continue, the people from Tulsa, when I asked them what message would they like me to communicate to the world in my research, and they said that they wanted the world to know that they rebuilt. They didn't run away. They weren't afraid. They stayed and they rebuilt. And so I promised them that I would communicate that message. So inherent in the concept or the phenomena of the racial trauma experienced by the folks in Greenwood, it's important to know that resilience was at the center of that, and that despite what they faced, they were able to rebuild and come back. Again, I want to yield my time to the next speaker, and thank you. I apologize for not being able to go through it thoroughly.